It was an ordinary morning when 17-year-old Amina left her house, heading to school as she did every day. She was a confident young woman, proud of who she was, her culture, her family, and especially her thick, curly hair. It was her crown, and she always wore it with pride. Little did she know that this seemingly normal day would change her life forever. As Amina walked down the street, she noticed a police car pull up beside her. The officer inside, a middle-aged man with a stern look on his face, motioned for her to stop. Amina's heart skipped a beat, though she had done nothing wrong. It was one of those moments where you didn't want to be noticed, but there you were, caught in someone else's gaze. The officer stepped out of his car and approached her. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering on her hair. He didn't greet her or ask her name. He just started questioning her, his voice sharp, demanding. Amina answered as politely as she could, her mind racing. She tried to stay calm, but something about his tone felt off, like he already had a judgment about her before she even said a word. "What's with that hair?" he asked bluntly, his words cutting through the air. "Don't you think it looks a little wild?" Amina froze. She had heard comments like this before, but the way he said it made her feel small, as if her very identity was being questioned. She had always been proud of her natural curls, but in that moment she felt ashamed, like she needed to apologize for something as simple as how she looked. "Excuse me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Don't think I don't know what you're up to," the officer sneered. "You're wasting my time. Get in the car." Amina was taken aback. She had no idea what he was talking about, but it was clear he wasn't listening. He continued to press her, asking questions she didn't understand, but she remained calm, refusing to back down. Then, out of nowhere, the officer made an unreasonable demand. "I need to see your hair. It's a safety issue," he insisted, his voice now tinged with authority. "We're going to shave it off." Amina was stunned. She had never experienced anything like this before. Shave her head. For what reason? It felt like an invasion of her personal space, a humiliating command without cause. But the officer's cold gaze left no room for negotiation. He wasn't asking. He was ordering. Amina felt trapped, unsure of what to do. She tried to stand her ground, but fear crept in. What would happen if she refused? Would he arrest her? Would things escalate? The officer reached into his car and pulled out a pair of clippers. He motioned for her to sit on the sidewalk, as if the situation was routine, as if he had done this to countless people before. Amina didn't know what to do. She was terrified. But she had no choice. She sat down, and with trembling hands, the officer began to shave her head. Amina's mind raced, her thoughts a blur. She had no idea how long it took, but each moment felt like an eternity. She could feel her hair being taken from her, her pride, her identity, her confidence, all being stripped away. The sound of the clippers buzzed in her ears, drowning out everything else. All she could think of was the injustice of it all. Finally, when it was over, the officer stepped back and gave her a harsh look, as though he had done something good. "You can go now," he said dismissively. Amina stood up, her head bare, her heart heavy. She didn't say a word as she turned to leave, the weight of the moment settling in. She knew she couldn't just forget what had happened. Something had to change, but she didn't know what to do next. One thing was clear, though. This officer had no idea who he had just crossed paths with. Days passed, and Amina tried to put the incident behind her, but the pain of that moment lingered in her mind. Her once beautiful, curly hair was now gone, and with it, a piece of her confidence seemed to have vanished. It wasn't just about the hair. It was about the way she had been treated, as if her worth was tied to her appearance. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that day and how powerless she had felt. Amina's father, Jamal, was a well-known figure in their community. He had built a reputation as a man who stood up for what was right, always fighting for equality and justice. He worked in local politics, but his passion was advocating for racial equality and the rights of underrepresented communities. His work had earned him respect, not just locally but also nationally. People looked to him as a voice for change, someone who could bring about real progress. Despite his position, Jamal had always tried to keep his daughter grounded. He taught her to be strong, to embrace who she was, and to stand up for herself. Amina had always looked up to her father for his wisdom and his courage. He had instilled in her a sense of pride in her identity, and that pride was reflected in how she carried herself. But now, in the wake of what had happened, she felt shattered. She couldn't help but wonder if her father would even understand the full extent of what she had gone through. She didn't want to worry him, but she knew she couldn't carry this pain alone. Amina kept her feelings hidden for days, pretending that everything was fine. She went to school, talked to her friends, and tried to act like she hadn't just experienced something that had changed her. But the reality was that she had been deeply affected by the officer's actions. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the evidence of her humiliation. The shaved head, the feeling of being less than. It was as if the officer had stripped away more than just her hair. He had taken away her sense of self-worth, her identity. One evening, while sitting at the kitchen table, Amina's father noticed something was off. He had always been good at reading people, especially his daughter. There was something in her eyes, something that wasn't right. He had seen this look before, and it worried him. Without saying a word, he sat down across from her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Amina looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She took a deep breath and began to tell her father what had happened. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, the words came more easily. She explained how the officer had shaved her head without her consent, how he had humiliated her in front of others, and how powerless she had felt in that moment. Jamal listened carefully, his expression unreadable, but his heart breaking for his daughter. As Amina finished, she looked at her father, expecting anger, frustration, or perhaps even disappointment. But what she saw on his face was something different. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, but there was also a fire that had been ignited by injustice, by the unfair treatment of his daughter. "I'm so sorry, Amina," Jamal said softly, his voice filled with both love and regret. "This should never have happened to you. No one should make you feel less than what you are." Amina nodded, wiping away a tear. She had been afraid that her father might not understand, but his response gave her a sense of comfort. He had always taught her to be proud of who she was, and now he was showing her how to turn this pain into strength. Together, they knew something had to be done. This wasn't just about the officer's actions, it was about standing up for what was right. And they would make sure that no one else would have to endure what Amina had gone through. What happened next would change everything. The days that followed were filled with a mix of emotions. Amina's father, Jamal, was determined to make sure that what had happened to his daughter didn't go unnoticed. He had always taught her to stand up for herself, but this time, it wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever faced injustice, discrimination, or unfair treatment. Amina's pain was not hers alone. It was a reminder of the bigger issue that had been ignored for too long. Jamal knew that his position in the community gave him a platform, a way to make a difference. He wasn't someone who took lightly the responsibility of being a voice for those who couldn't always speak up. His work in politics and racial justice had earned him respect, but he had never imagined he would be using his influence for something so personal. Still, the moment had come, and he knew he couldn't remain silent. After listening to Amina's story, Jamal wasted no time. He began reaching out to other leaders in the community, people he had worked with in the past, activists, community organizers, and lawyers. He wanted to make sure that this incident wouldn't be brushed aside. He also contacted local news outlets, knowing that public awareness was key to making real change. The injustice Amina had faced wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Amina, for her part, was both relieved and nervous. The thought of making this public was overwhelming, but she understood why her father was pushing so hard. She had never thought about the broader implications of what had happened to her. But as Jamal spoke about the issue, she began to realize that her experience wasn't an isolated incident. There were others like her, people who had been treated unfairly simply because of the way they looked, the color of their skin, or their identity. At school, Amina's friends and teachers noticed the change in her. She was quieter, more withdrawn than before. Her shaved head was the first thing people noticed, but it wasn't just the physical change. Amina had always been the confident, outspoken girl, but now she seemed to be carrying the weight of something much heavier than her hair. Her friends tried to comfort her, but they didn't fully understand what she was going through. The reality was that none of them could. They hadn't faced the kind of discrimination Amina had. They hadn't been forced to deal with the sting of being humiliated by someone in a position of power. Amina's classmates had seen the news reports that her father had been pushing for. It was clear that something bigger was unfolding. Her father had been speaking out not just for her, but for everyone who had been hurt by the same system. And although Amina was still struggling with the personal pain of that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could lead to a change. In the days that followed, Jamal's efforts began to gain traction. The news spread quickly through the community. People rallied together to support Amina, sending messages of love and solidarity. There were even some who came forward with their own stories of injustice, of being mistreated by authority figures, of facing discrimination based on their appearance. It became clear that Amina's experience was not an isolated one, and that made the whole situation even more powerful. It wasn't just one person's story. It was a collective story that needed to be told. And so, with every step Jamal took, with every call he made, Amina began to feel a sense of strength that she hadn't known before. She had her father's support, and now she had the support of her community. The officers' actions might have tried to break her, but instead, they had brought her closer to something bigger than herself. Together, they would make sure that what happened to Amina wouldn't just fade into the past. It was the beginning of something important, something that would change how people viewed justice and equality in their community. As the days went by, the attention around Amina's story grew. Jamal's decision to speak out had sparked a movement, and people from all over the community were coming together to support her. The news outlets were covering the story, sharing the details of the incident, and more importantly, highlighting the bigger issue of racial prejudice. The officers' actions had made headlines, but now, the focus was on change, on holding people accountable for their actions. Amina was still struggling with the personal impact of the experience. Every time she looked in the mirror, she was reminded of what had happened. The moment when someone had stripped away her confidence and made her feel less than. But the more she saw the support pouring in, the more she began to realize that she was not alone. It was hard for her to accept that something good could come from such a painful experience, but she couldn't deny the growing sense of solidarity that was taking place. Her father's efforts were making a difference, and she was starting to feel like she was part of something much larger than herself. One evening, Jamal sat down with Amina at the kitchen table. They had always shared open conversations, and now, with everything that had been happening, it felt even more important to talk about how they were both feeling. Jamal looked at his daughter with deep concern, understanding the weight she was carrying. "Amina," he began softly, "I know this has been hard for you, but you're stronger than you realize. You've got people behind you now. This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about showing others that we won't stand for injustice. I'm proud of you, and I want you to know that we're going to make sure something like this never happens again." Amina listened carefully, feeling comforted by her father's words. She had always admired his strength, his ability to stand tall in the face of adversity, but now she was beginning to see that strength in herself. It wasn't just about being brave. It was about using her voice to make a difference. The pain was still there, but it was starting to shift. With each passing day, she found herself feeling more empowered, ready to stand up not only for herself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Jamal had been in contact with local community leaders, lawyers, and civil rights activists, all of whom rallied behind Amina. They were determined to ensure that the officer faced consequences for his actions. There was talk of starting a petition, pushing for greater accountability in law enforcement, and raising awareness about the deep-rooted issues of racial discrimination. Jamal's voice had always been powerful, but now it was even more so. He wasn't just fighting for Amina anymore. He was fighting for a cause, for the many voices that had gone unheard for too long. The pressure was mounting on the officer. The public response was swift and strong, with many people expressing their outrage over what had happened. The officer had gone too far, and now there was nowhere to hide. He was being held accountable in ways he had never anticipated. People from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, were coming forward to demand justice, and Amina's story had become a catalyst for change. At school, Amina was beginning to notice the shift in how people viewed her. Her classmates, who had once been distant, were now more supportive. They were starting to understand what she had gone through and were offering their encouragement. Teachers, too, had expressed their regret over the incident and were looking for ways to make sure something like this would never happen again. The officer's behavior had unintentionally sparked something bigger than just a personal grievance. It had brought attention to the systemic issues that affected not just Amina, but countless others who had faced similar struggles. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the need for change, for fairness, and for a world where everyone, regardless of their appearance, was treated with respect and dignity. As Amina and Jamal continued their journey, they realized that their fight wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about changing hearts and minds, about inspiring others to stand up for what was right, and about ensuring that no one else would have to experience what Amina had. Their journey was just beginning, and though the road ahead might be challenging, they knew they were stronger together. With each step, they were getting closer to the world they wanted to see, one where respect, fairness, and equality were more than just ideals, but everyday realities. As the days passed, the weight of the situation became more real for both Amina and her father, Jamal. The attention around the incident had started to grow, and while some of the media coverage was focused on the officer's actions, much of it was directed toward the larger issue of racial discrimination in their community. Jamal was determined to make sure that Amina's experience wasn't just seen as a personal tragedy. It had to become part of the bigger conversation on how to create change. He knew that one person's voice could make a difference, but many voices united could change the world. The officer who had shaved Amina's head was beginning to realize the magnitude of his actions. The public outrage had not been easy for him to ignore. Calls for his resignation flooded in from all directions, and the local news stations were reporting on the incident every day. There were protests and demonstrations in the streets, and people were demanding justice not only for Amina, but for all those who had been unfairly treated by figures of authority in the past. What had seemed like a small and personal mistake on the officer's part was quickly snowballing into a much larger issue. Jamal was in constant communication with community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. He knew that this situation wasn't going to be resolved overnight, but he was determined to stay the course. Amina, although still struggling with her own feelings of embarrassment and anger, was starting to see the larger picture. She knew her father was doing everything in his power to make sure the officer was held accountable, but she also understood that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about sending a message to the entire community that injustice would no longer be tolerated. One afternoon, Amina and her father sat down for a conversation that would change everything. They had been through so much already, but now the reality of the situation was starting to settle in. Amina had seen how much her father was putting into this fight, and she couldn't help but feel the pressure of carrying this burden. But her father, ever the pillar of support, reassured her. "Amina," Jamal said softly, looking at his daughter with deep affection, "you don't have to carry this alone. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about showing the world that we won't allow people to be treated this way. We're standing up for what's right, and I'm proud of you for helping us make a difference." Amina had always admired her father's strength, but now she was beginning to realize that she, too, could be a part of the change. It wasn't easy, and the pain was still there, but she understood the power of her voice. Her father had spent his life fighting for justice, and now it was her turn to add to that fight. She realized that her story wasn't just her own. It was shared by many others who had been hurt in similar ways. And if she could use her experience to bring awareness to the larger issue of racial inequality, then it would all be worth it. With renewed determination, Amina began to speak out more. She shared her story with local community groups, talking about the importance of standing up to authority when it's wrong and the impact that one person's actions could have on an entire community. Her words were powerful, and people listened. Slowly but surely, she was starting to heal, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. The officer, realizing the enormity of the situation, tried to avoid the media. But it was too late. His actions had already been exposed, and now he had to face the consequences. It wasn't just about him losing his job. It was about the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He was forced to confront the reality of his actions, and the public, now more aware than ever, was demanding accountability. Amina knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The pain of what happened to her would take time to heal, but she also knew that she had a purpose now. She wasn't just the girl who had been humiliated on the sidewalk. She was a voice for those who had been silenced, a symbol of strength for those who had been wronged. With her father by her side, Amina was ready to continue the fight, knowing that each step forward brought her closer to the change she wanted to see in the world. As the weeks went by, Amina's story continued to capture the attention of the community. What had started as a personal experience of injustice had turned into something much larger, a movement for change. The media coverage intensified, and more people began to take notice of the officer's actions. Jamal, Amina's father, worked tirelessly to make sure the story was not forgotten. He had become a figurehead for the movement, using his influence to push for accountability and awareness. Despite the growing support, the officer who had wronged Amina still hadn't fully grasped the consequences of his actions. He had hoped that the public outcry would fade away, that people would eventually move on. But the anger and frustration continued to build. Calls for his resignation, protests, and petitions were not slowing down. People in the community were no longer willing to let such behavior go unpunished. It became clear to the officer that the longer he avoided the situation, the worse it would become. Amina, though still carrying the weight of the incident, was beginning to find strength in the movement that her father had helped build. Her feelings of humiliation had not disappeared, but they were starting to shift. It wasn't about the officer anymore. It was about something much bigger. She had become part of a conversation that had been long overdue, a conversation about justice, equality, and respect. The support she received from strangers, friends, and family made her realize that she wasn't alone in this. What had happened to her was wrong, and the more people spoke out, the louder her voice became. One afternoon, Jamal received a call that would change everything. It was from a local news station, requesting an interview with both him and Amina. The reporter wanted to speak with them about the case and the steps that had been taken in response to the officer's actions. Jamal knew this was an important moment, not just for their family, but for the entire community. The conversation had reached a tipping point, and now it was time to push for real change. Amina was nervous at first. Speaking out had never been easy for her, and the thought of being on television, talking about something so personal, felt overwhelming. But her father encouraged her, reminding her of the importance of their voice in this moment. He assured her that they weren't just speaking for themselves, they were speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The interview aired live, and the response was overwhelming. Jamal spoke with passion about the need for justice and accountability, but it was Amina's words that resonated with people the most. She spoke with honesty, describing the pain she felt when the officer shaved her head, but also the hope she now carried as part of the larger movement for change. She talked about the support she had received and how it had helped her find strength, even in the most difficult moments. "I may have lost my hair, but I found my voice," Amina said, her words powerful and clear. "This isn't just about me. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. It's about making sure we all get treated with the respect we deserve, no matter who we are." The response to the interview was immediate. People from all over the community, and even from other places, reached out to offer their support. Many shared their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Echoing Amina's words, it became clear that the issue went far beyond one officer's actions. It was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. In the following days, the officer was placed under investigation. The pressure from the public had reached a point where the local authorities could no longer ignore it. Jamal continued to advocate for accountability, pushing for not just disciplinary action against the officer, but also for reform in the way law enforcement handled issues of racial discrimination. Though Amina's personal pain was far from over, she began to see a glimmer of hope. Her voice, once silenced by fear, was now part of a larger conversation that had the potential to bring real change. As she looked around at the growing support and the momentum that was building, she felt a sense of pride. She was no longer just the girl who had been humiliated on the sidewalk. She was a symbol of resilience and strength, and the journey had just begun. Together, with the support of her father and the community, Amina knew they were making a difference. What had started as an act of cruelty had sparked something much bigger. It wasn't just about justice for her. It was about justice for everyone. As the investigation into the officer's actions moved forward, Amina and her father, Jamal, found themselves at the center of a larger conversation. The incident that had started as a personal attack on Amina had evolved into a public discussion about fairness, respect, and the treatment of people based on their race or appearance. What had seemed like a small, isolated moment of injustice had now become a turning point for the community, a catalyst for change. The officer, once confident in his authority, was now under intense scrutiny. He had been placed on administrative leave as the investigation continued, but the public's response was clear. There would be consequences. People who had once ignored the subtle prejudices around them were now speaking out, demanding accountability. The officer's behavior, which many had dismissed as an isolated incident, was now being recognized as part of a larger, deeply ingrained problem in the system. For Amina, the weight of the situation had started to shift. She no longer felt as isolated in her pain. The outpouring of support from her community had been overwhelming, and she was beginning to understand just how much impact one person's story could have. But there were still moments when the past crept up on her. The memory of the officer's harsh words, the sound of the clippers buzzing, the feeling of humiliation that had settled in her heart. Even with the public support and the progress they had made, the emotional scars were still there. Her father, ever the pillar of support, reminded her that healing wasn't a linear process. Some days would be harder than others, but they were moving in the right direction. Jamal had always believed in justice, but now he was seeing firsthand how powerful it could be when a community came together to demand it. He had worked his whole life for change. But this, seeing his daughter find strength in the face of adversity, was something that left him in awe. The community's response to Amina's story had continued to grow. People who had never before spoken out against racial injustice were now standing with her, sharing their own experiences and showing their support. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a collective fight for fairness and respect. The media coverage was still ongoing, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just another news story. It was a movement, one that would resonate long after the officer's fate was decided. Amina knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the pain of what had happened would feel fresh, and there would be moments of doubt. But with each passing day, she felt a little more empowered. She wasn't just a victim of an unjust situation. She was a part of something larger than herself. The more she spoke out, the more she realized the importance of her voice. She had the power to inspire change, to help others who had been silenced for too long. The officer, as the investigation continued, was facing mounting pressure. The local authorities were taking the situation seriously, and there was talk of more comprehensive training for law enforcement officers on racial sensitivity and proper conduct. It became clear that the community was no longer willing to accept such behavior as the status quo. The officers' actions, though deeply hurtful to Amina, had opened the door to a much-needed conversation about fairness, respect, and accountability. In the end, the officer was fired. The decision was met with mixed reactions, but for Amina and her family, it was a step in the right direction. They knew that losing his job wasn't the end of the fight. It was a small victory in a much larger struggle for equality. Amina's journey wasn't over, but she was no longer the same girl who had walked into that officer's path weeks earlier. She was stronger, more confident, and ready to continue the fight for justice. As the dust began to settle, Jamal took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. He looked at his daughter, proud of the courage she had shown in the face of adversity. "You did something important, Amina," he said quietly. "You stood up for yourself, and you stood up for all those who didn't have a voice. That's something to be proud of." Amina smiled, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She had been through so much, but now, with the support of her father and her community, she knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about one moment. It was about creating a future where everyone could feel safe and respected. As time went on, Amina's story became a symbol of change, a reminder of how one person's strength could spark a broader movement. The officer who had wronged her had faced the consequences of his actions, but for Amina and her father, Jamal, this was only the beginning. While the officer had been fired and the community had rallied together, Amina knew there was still much work to be done. She was no longer just the girl who had been humiliated. She was now a voice for those who had been silenced, a leader in the fight for justice. The support from the community hadn't faded after the officer's firing. Instead, it had grown stronger. People from all walks of life continued to show their solidarity with Amina, sharing their own stories of discrimination and standing up for fairness in ways they never had before. The media had continued to follow the story, but now the focus was shifting toward the solutions, the actions that could prevent such injustices from happening again. Jamal, who had spent much of his life advocating for racial justice, was now seeing the impact of his work in a very personal way. He had always believed that change was possible, but it was through his daughter's bravery that he realized how much power one voice could have. Amina had sparked something within the community, and Jamal knew that this was a turning point. He had been fighting for equality for years, but now he could see that the fight was becoming a shared mission, one that would continue long after this particular incident. Amina, for her part, had come to terms with the impact the experience had on her. The emotional scars were still there, but she no longer felt the need to hide them. Speaking out, sharing her story, and standing up for others who had faced similar injustices had become a part of her healing process. She was stronger now, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. She no longer feared the judgment of others. Instead, she embraced her identity and the power of her voice. The road to healing hadn't been easy, and Amina knew that there would be more challenges ahead. But she had learned that standing up for what was right was worth any obstacle. It wasn't just about her personal experience anymore. It was about making sure that future generations wouldn't have to go through what she did. It was about creating a world where respect for all people, regardless of their appearance, race, or background, was the norm rather than the exception. As Amina continued to speak out at local rallies and community events, she was amazed by the number of people who reached out to her, thanking her for her courage and for making them feel heard. She realized that her story wasn't just her own. It was a collective story shared by many. Each person who had faced similar struggles, each person who had been silenced, now had a chance to stand up and be heard. One afternoon, as Amina and her father walked through the neighborhood, they noticed something that made them stop and take notice. People who had once turned a blind eye to the issues of racial inequality were now engaging in conversations, asking questions, and taking action. There were new programs being introduced in schools and workplaces aimed at fostering understanding and tolerance. The ripple effect of Amina's story had spread far and wide, and it was clear that change was beginning to take hold. Jamal looked at his daughter with pride. "You've done more than you'll ever know," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Your courage has inspired so many people. You've given them hope." Amina smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the support she had received. She knew that her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had found strength in the face of adversity, and now she was using that strength to help others find theirs. The world was beginning to change, one person at a time, and Amina was proud to be part of that change. As the sun set on another day, Amina and her father walked side by side, knowing that their fight for justice wasn't just about a single victory. It was about creating a future where everyone could walk through life with their head held high, proud of who they were, and treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The journey was long, but together, they would continue to move forward, one step at a time.